Hey everyone. Anyone particularly focused on any news story of the many to choose from?
I, for one, cannot keep up. So, yeah, no.
Okay. Well, just in case you missed it, apparently PBS and NBR are anti-American. Um, and I'm guessing the Republicans in Congress were feeling left out. So they're getting in on the fun and they're going to have a hearing with them or on them or whatever. Because, as you know, in my entire lifetime of listening and watching PBS and NPR, I don't believe I've ever heard them refer to the U.S. as an empire or imperial power, uh, and yet they are anti-American. We'll figure.
Yeah, I know they're not like lefties. They are quite the soft propaganda for supporting the state, really. I
Right?
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're
Now with
always
that,
making things logical and make sense
yeah.
and very cool about it, right?
Well, now that you say that, now that would be an honest critique from these yahoos, right? Like
Hmm.
that's what they're against. So
Right,
if they were honest, they'd say we don't like you because you try and find stability and reason and everything. I
right.
will say,
We're on
although I haven't.
we're on
Mhm.
YouTube right now, just so you know.
Well,
Okay.
don't come and get me, spies. Don't come and get
Come
me,
and get me.
whoever.
Yeah, let me just share my signal
Well, they're
now.
grabbing more people off the street. They grabbed
Oh,
another person off the street yesterday.
oh no.
She was a graduate student at Tufts. Apparently, she wrote an op-ed, and plainclothes feds grabbed her of one kind or another. Hope
Wow.
she's still in
I
the state of Massachusetts. It's not to laugh. It is,
no.
fortunately, the
Yeah.
whole event was caught on videotape, which was good.
Well, the I didn't. I guess I didn't know about that one, but there's another one where another one of someone who was an academic was in hiding or just not. They didn't know where she was. Um, shit, where was she from? Similar case, but a few
Yeah,
days ago.
but was she from Columbia as well?
No, no, she's
Yeah,
from
I think
Tufts.
so.
She's a PhD
Oh,
student Oh, you're
oh,
talking about Columbia. Yeah, they
right.
grabbed another
She came
Columbia
when she
person.
was 7, you
Yeah.
know, and yeah. So this is why, during the State of the Union, I wanted, all of those elected officials that are against this to, be carried out, because this is what needs to be seen. It's the same thing. It's the
It's
violence.
all it's all for show, I'm sorry to say. It's pretty much PR, I'm sorry to say. But
The oh,
these are all they're just it's terrorism. They're going to pick a
right.
few they're going to select a few examples, and of course and it's meant to offset the incompetence that they showed with all those people they dragged off to El Salvador.
Mhm.
Because a couple of them, well, first of all, they weren't male, and they're being put in a male prison. Number two, there are people who are not legal citizens, but they're in the country legally, and they took them too. And then one I'm going to put up on is they took someone because of his tattoos or tattoo, which was a autism um, awareness tattoo, but
I
I guess it was. You could interpret an autism tattoo, awareness tattoo, as a terrorist object or a gang object.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll put that up soon. I better get started before I start talking into the ether. Um, All right. Well, yesterday, welcome, welcome, one and all to 26 March dis&dat information. I'm going to talk a little bit about I may get to, let's put it that way. I'm introducing two pieces on Marx and law. Although the first one is written by Engels and Kautsky a couple of years after Marx passes away. It represents at least one point of view on law, um, but it's a little bit more about humanity and, or at least the institutions, modern institutions up till then, 1887. The second one is from the 1844 Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, I think, and it's on property, which pretty much that's what law is all about, with all respect. I mean, on the one hand, there are rights to oneself, which are proprietary rights, we could say, sovereign rights. Of course, if you take it too far, sovereign citizenship becomes problematic, but in some ways anyway. And the things after that, I'll probably get to tomorrow. And that has to do with a 1983 review of a 1982 book on Marxism and law, which I think is still relevant, actually may be more relevant. So I included that. And also a reference to Pistor's Code of Capital, which is more current. I don't think she would call herself Marxist by any means, but it's clearly a Marxist text, or at least to me anyway, when you talk about Code of Capital. And then I've sort of figured out what I want to do with other things. I've already set up that probably complete this sort of Marxism and law reading tomorrow in dis&dat. On Saturday, I think I'll begin a very long, an extensive sort of read-in, as it were. It's on Marx. What? Is there an objection? A question? No? All right. On Saturdays, I'm going to begin reading the Theories of Surplus Value, the mythical volume 4 of Capital, and it's essentially from the most recent version, which I think is the uh, uh, Marxism Internet Archive version of, I think, 2013 of Theories of Surplus Value, which is the most widely available one. Although I think whoever's doing the MEGA revisions, well, I'm sure there's one out there, and I'll try and hunt it down. But I think that the current popular version, I suppose, is the electronic versions of about 2013 of that text. And as I've said before, although I may have to change the date. Well, no, I don't think I've put it up yet. We're going to do the next two chapters of Karl Marx Capital Volume 1 of 2024, the 2024 Princeton edition. And we'll do that on Sunday. And then on Monday, I can't remember what it is. I think we're doing something on Lenin. I haven't put that up yet, or maybe I have. No, I haven't yet. It's on Lenin. And it has to do, it's sort of a continuation of the Saturday thing, which is the preface to Theories of Surplus Value. And the reason why I'm doing it is because it has elements of what I read yesterday, although it went into the ether, on Kautsky talking about fundamentals of Marxism. So I know that sounds all very complicated. It's not very complicated. Today's little thing will lead into tomorrow's, and tomorrow's will, on Monday, will lead to probably Lenin, because Lenin comments on pretty much the same issues and is summarizes in a variety of ways Marx in a fairly compressed way, which is very useful for talking to other people about it so they don't have to go drag out a 1,000-page book to sort of explain stuff. So that's kind of where I am right now with doing stuff. So every Saturday and Sunday on Weekly Marx, it's theories of surplus value on Saturday and probably something from Capital Volume 1, the new 2024 edition on Sundays. So that's kind of what we're going to do. And it's going to take a long time to get through it because we're only up to chapter 16 in Volume 1. And so we'll be on that for at least another, I don't know, 10 weeks or something, or 5 weeks. I have no idea. And theories of surplus value in print form is about 1,000 pages. So your mileage may vary. So today, Engels and Kautsky, 1886, 3 years after Marx's death, on lawyers' socialism. And so the source, of course, is Marx and Engels on religion. And in effect, it's talking about institutional matters, but it goes to the juridical. And I think that this is an interesting piece, partially because it's historical, partially because it's, kind of anti-religious on the one hand. On the other hand, it gives us a sense of institutionally what we have to put up with or how Marxism begins to configure itself. And of course, it becomes much more organized in terms of Marxists and non-Marxists on legal questions, which is what the review that is included today, but we'll probably only get to tomorrow, is about. The world outlook of the Middle Ages was substantially theological. The unity of the European world, which actually did not exist internally, was established externally against the common Saracen foe. It's like Adnan stuff by Christianity. The unity of the West European world, which consisted of a group of nations developing in continual intercourse, was welded in Catholicism. This theological welding was not only in ideas, it existed in reality, not only in the Pope, its monarchistic center, but above all in the feudally and hierarchically organized church, which, owning about a third of the land in every country in Western Europe, occupied a position of tremendous power in the feudal organization. The church, with its feudal land ownership, was the real link between the different countries. The feudal organization of the church gave a religious consecration to the secular feudal state system. Besides, the clergy was the only educated class. Thank goodness for scholasticism. It was therefore natural that church dogma was the starting point and basis of all thought, noting, of course, that, history has corrected us on a whole bunch of matters, including Arabic thought and particularly the number system. But anyway, jurisprudence, natural science, philosophy, everything was dealt with according to whether its content agreed or disagreed with the doctrines of the church. But in the womb of feudalism, the power of the bourgeoisie was developing. A new class appeared in opposition to the big landowners. The city burghers were first and foremost and exclusively producers of and traders in commodities, while the feudal mode of production was based substantially on self-consumption of the product within a limited circle, partly by the producers and partly by the feudal lord. The Catholic world outlook, fashioned on the pattern of feudalism, was no longer adequate for this new class and its conditions of production and exchange. Nevertheless, this new class remained for a long time a captive in the bonds of almighty theology. From the 13th to the 17th century, all the reformations and the struggles carried out under religious slogans that were connected with them were, on the theoretical side, nothing but repeated attempts of the burghers and plebeians in the towns and the peasants, who had become rebellious by contact with both of the latter, to adapt the old theological world outlook to the changed economic conditions and the condition of life of the new class. But that could not be done. The flag of religion, waved for the last time in England in the 17th century, and hardly 50 years later appeared undisguised in France, the New World Outlook, which was to become the classical outlook of bourgeoisie, the juristic world outlook. So, thank you, Enlightenment. It was a secularization of the theological outlook. Human right took the place of dogma, of divine right. The state took the place of the church. The economic and social conditions which had formerly been imagined to have been created by the church and dogma because they were sanctioned by the church were now considered as founded on right and created by the state. Because commodity exchange on a social scale and in its full development, particularly through advance and credit, produces complicated mutual contract relations and therefore demands generally applicable rules that can be given only by the community, that is, state determined standards of right. It was imagined that these standards of right arose not from the economic facts, but from formal establishment by the state or by the crown. And because competition, the basic form of trade of free commodity producers, is the greatest equalizer, equality before the law became the main battle cry of the bourgeoisie. The fact that this newly aspiring class's struggle against the feudal lords, or landed property, and the absolute monarchy then protecting them, like every class struggle, had to be a political struggle, a struggle for the mastery of the state, and had to be fought on juridical demands, contributed to strengthen the juristic outlook. Now, but the bourgeoisie produced its negative double, that is, the proletariat, and with it a new class struggle which broke out before the bourgeoisie had completed the conquest of political power. As the bourgeoisie in its time had by force of tradition dragged the theological outlook with it for a while in its fight against the nobility, so too the proletariat at first took over the juristic outlook from its opponent and sought in it weapons against the bourgeoisie. The first elements of the proletarian party, as well as their theoretical representatives, remained wholly on the juristic ground of right. The only distinction being that they built up for themselves a different ground of right from that of the bourgeoisie. On one side, the demand for equality was extended so that equality in right could be completed by social equality, right? Equal under the law, as they say. On the other, from Madam Smith's proposition that labor is the source of all wealth, but that the product of labor must be shared with the landowner and the capitalist, the conclusion was drawn that this sharing was unjust and must either be abolished or modified in favor of the worker. Now, but the feeling that to leave this question on the mere juristic ground of right in no way made possible the abolition of the evil conditions created by the bourgeois capitalistic mode of production, i.e., the mode of production based on large-scale industry, already then led the major minds among the earlier socialists, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, to abandon entirely the juristic political field and to declare all political struggle fruitless. Now, both of these views were equally unsatisfactory to express adequately and embrace completely the working class's desire for emancipation created by economic conditions, the demand for the full product of labor, and just as much the demand for equality lost themselves in unsolvable contradictions as soon as they were formulated juristically in detail and left the core of the question, that is, the transformation of the mode of production, more or less untouched. The rejection of the political struggle by the great utopians was at the same time the rejection of the class struggle, i.e., of the only form of activity of the class whose interests they represented. Now, both outlooks made abstraction of the historical background to which they owed their existence. Both appealed to feeling, some to the feeling of justice, others to the feeling of humanity. Both attired their demands in the form of pious wishes of which one could not say why they had to be fulfilled at that very time and not 1,000 years earlier or 1,000 years later. The working class, who by the changing of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode was deprived of all ownership of the means of production, and by the mechanism of the capitalist mode of production, is continually engendered anew in that hereditary state of propertylessness, cannot find an exhaustive expression of its living condition in the juristic illusion of the bourgeoisie. It can only know that condition of life fully itself if it looks at things in their reality without juristically colored glasses. But Marx helped it to do that with his materialist conception of history by providing the proof that all man's juristic, political, philosophical, religious, and other ideas are derived in the last resort from his economic conditions of life, from his mode of production and of exchanging the product. Thus, he provided the world outlook corresponding to the conditions of life and struggle of the proletariat. Only lack of illusions in the heads of the workers could correspond to their lack of property. And this proletarian world outlook is now spreading over the world. Now, so that's, 1887 and kind of an evolution from probably a much rosier view of the world in 1844. The economic and philosophical manuscripts often referred to in some ways as the, before the epistemological break of Marx, something that represents the so-called humanist Marx, etc. This is a section on private property and communism. The antithesis between lack of property and property, so long as it's not comprehended as the antithesis of labor and capital, still remains an indifferent antithesis, not grasped in its active connection, in its internal relation, not yet grasped as a contradiction. It can find expression in this first form even without the advanced development of private property as in ancient Rome or Turkey, etc. It does not yet appear as having been established by private property itself. But labor, the subjective essence of private property as exclusion of property, and capital, objective labor as exclusion of labor, constitute private property as its developed state of contradiction, hence a dynamic relationship driving towards resolution. The transcendence of self-estrangement follows the same course as self-estrangement. Private property is first considered only in its objective aspect, but nevertheless with labor as its essence. Its form of existence is therefore capital, which is to be annulled as such, that's Proudhon's position, or a particular form of labor, labor leveled down, fragmented, and therefore unfree, is conceived as the source of private property's perniciousness and of his existence in estrangement from men. For instance, Fourier, who, like the physiocrats, also conceives agricultural labor to be at least the exemplary type, whereas Saint-Simon declares in contrast that industrial labor as such is the essence, accordingly aspires to the exclusive rule of the industrialists and the improvement of the workers' condition. Finally, communism is the positive expression of annulled private property, at first as universal private property. Now, by embracing this relation as a whole, communism is, number one, in its first form, only a generalization and consummation of this relation. As such, it appears in a twofold form. On the one hand, the dominion of material property bulks so large that it wants to destroy everything which is not capable of being possessed by all as private property. It's kind of a libertarian view. It wants to disregard talent, etc., in an arbitrary fashion. For it, the sole purpose of life and existence is direct physical possession. The category of the worker is not done away with, but extended to all men. The relationship of private property persists as the relationship of the community to the world of things. Finally, this movement of opposing universal property to private property finds expression in the brutish form of opposing to marriage, certainly a form of exclusive private property, the community of women, in which a woman becomes a piece of communal and common property. It may be said that this idea of the community of women gives away the secret of this as yet completely crude and thoughtless communism. just as a woman passes from marriage to general prostitution. Prostitution is only a specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer. And since it's a relationship which falls not on the prostitute alone, but also on the one who prostitutes, and the latter's abomination is still greater, the capitalist, etc., also comes under this head. So the entire world of wealth, that is, of man's objective substance, passes from the relationship of exclusive marriage with the owner of private property to a state of universal prostitution with the community. This type of communism, since it negates the personality of man in every sphere, is but the logical expression of private property, which is this negation. General envy, constituting itself as power, is the disguise in which greed reestablishes itself and satisfies itself only in another way, incels. The thought of every piece of private property as such is at least turned against wealthier private property in the form of envy, and the urge to reduce things to a common level, so that this envy and urge even constitute the essence of competition. Crude communism is only the culmination of this envy and of this leveling down proceeding from the preconceived minimum. It has a definite, limited standard. How little this annulment of private property is really an appropriation is in fact proved by the abstract negation of the entire world of culture and civilization, the regression to the unnatural simplicity of the poor and crude man who has few needs and who has not only failed to go beyond private property, but has not even reached it. The community is only a community of labor and equality of wages paid out by communal capital by the community as the universal capitalist. Both sides of the relationship are raised to an imagined universality. Labor as the category in which every person is placed, and capital as the acknowledged universality and power of the community. In the approach to women, as the spoil and handmaid of communal lust, is expressed the infinite degradation in which man exists for himself, for the secret of this approach has its unambiguous, decisive, plain, and undisguised expression in the relation of man to woman and in the manner in which the direct and natural species relationship is conceived. The direct, natural, and necessary relation of person to person is the relation of man to woman. In this natural species relationship, man's relation to nature is immediately his relation to man, just as his relation to man is immediately his relation to nature, his own natural destination, ashes to ashes, etc. In this relationship, therefore, is seriously manifested, reduced to an observable fact, the extent to which the human essence has become nature to man, or to which nature to him has become the human essence of man. From this relationship, one can therefore judge man's whole level of development. From the character of this relationship follows how much man as a species being, as man, has come to be himself and to comprehend it himself. The relation of man to woman is the most natural relation of human being to human being. It therefore reveals the extent to which man's natural behavior has become human, or the extent to which the human essence in him has become a natural essence, the extent to which his human nature has become natural to him. This relationship also reveals the extent to which man's need has become a human need, the extent to which, therefore, the other person, the other, as a person, has become for him a need, the extent to which he in his individual existence is at the same time a social being. The first positive annulment of private property, crude communism, is thus merely a manifestation of the vileness of private property, which wants to set itself up as the positive community system. Number two, communism, A, still political in nature, democratic or despotic. B, or alpha, still political in nature, democratic or despotic. Beta, with the abolition of the state, yet still incomplete and still being affected by private property, i.e. by the estrangement of man. In both forms, communism already is aware of being reintegration or return of man to himself the transcendence of human self-estrangement, but since it has not yet grasped the positive essence of private property, and just as little the human nature of need, it remains captive to it and infected by it. It has indeed grasped its concept, but not its essence. Number three, communism as the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e., human being, a return accomplished consciously and embracing the entire wealth of previous development. This communism, as fully developed naturalism, equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It's the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. The entire movement of history, just as its, that is, communism's actual act of genesis, the birth act of its empirical existence, is therefore, for its thinking, consciousness, the comprehended and known process of its becoming. Whereas the still immature communism seeks a historical proof for itself, a proof in the realm of what already exists among disconnected historical phenomena opposed to private property, tearing single phases from the historical process and focusing attention on them as proofs of its historical pedigree, a hobby horse ridden hard, especially by Cabet, Villagardel, etc. By so doing, it simply makes clear that by far the greater part of this process contradicts its own claim, and that, if it ever has existed, precisely its being in the past refutes its pretension to reality. Now, it's easy to see that the entire revolutionary movement necessarily finds both its empirical and its theoretical basis in the movement of private property, more precisely in that of the economy. This material, immediately perceptible private property is the material, perceptible expression of estranged human life. Its movement, that is, production and consumption, is the perceptible revelation of the movement of all production until now, i.e., the realization or the reality of man. Religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc., are only particular modes of production and fall under its general law. The positive transcendence of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive transcendence of all estrangement. That is to say, the return of man from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, i.e., social existence. Religious estrangement, as such, occurs only in the realms of consciousness, of man's inner life, but economic estrangement is that of real life. Its transcendence, therefore, embraces both aspects. It is evident that the initial stage of the movement amongst the various peoples depends on whether the true, recognized life of the people manifests itself more in consciousness or in the external world. Depends on whether the true recognized life of the people manifests itself in consciousness or in the external world is more ideal or real. Communism begins from the outset with atheism. But atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, that atheism is still mostly an abstraction. The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical. Abstract philanthropy and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action. We have seen how, on the assumption of positively annulled private property, man produces man, that is, himself and the other man. how the object, being the direct manifestation of his individuality, is simultaneously his own existence for the other man, the existence of the other man, and that existence for him. Likewise, however, both the material of labor and man as the subject are the point of departure as well as the result of the movement, and precisely in this fact that they must constitute the point of departure lies the historical necessity of private property. Thus, the social character is the general character of the whole movement. Just as society itself produces man as man, so is society produced by him. Activity and enjoyment, both in their content and in their mode of existence, are social. Social activity and social enjoyment. The human aspect of nature exists only for a social man. For only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other, and the other's existence for him, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. Only here has what to him, his natural existence, become his human existence, and nature become man for him. Thus, society is the complete unity of man with nature, the true resurrection of nature, the consistent naturalism of man, and the consistent humanism of nature. Social activity and social enjoyment exist by no means only in the form of some directly communal activity and directly communal enjoyment. Although communal activity and communal enjoyment, i.e., activity and enjoyment which are manifested and affirmed in actual direct association with other men, will occur wherever such a direct expression of sociability stems from the true character of the activity's content and is appropriate to the nature of the enjoyment. Play ball. But also, when I am active scientifically, etc., an activity which I can seldom perform in direct community with others, then my activity is social because I perform it as a man. Not only is the material of my activity given to me as a social product, as is even the language in which the thinker is active, my own existence is social activity, and therefore that which I make of myself. I make of myself for society and with the consciousness of myself as a social being. My general consciousness is only the theoretical shape of that of which the living shape is the real community, the social fabric. Although at the present day, general consciousness is an abstraction from real life and as such confronts it with hostility. The activity of my general consciousness as an activity is therefore also my theoretical existence as a social being. Now, above all, we must avoid postulating society again as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. Now, the individual is the social being. His manifestations of life, even if they may not appear in the direct form of communal manifestations of life carried out in association with others, are therefore an expression and confirmation of social life. Man's individual and species life are not different, however much, and this is inevitable, the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular or a more general mode of the life of the species. Or the life of the species is a more particular or more general individual life. So he's playing with these little kind of tautologies or truisms. In his consciousness of species, man confirms his real social life and simply repeats his real existence in thought, just as conversely, the being of the species confirms itself in species consciousness and exists for itself in its generality as a thinking being. Man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, and it is precisely his particularity which makes him an individual, and a real individual social being, is as much the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of imagined and experienced society for itself, just as he exists also in the real world, both as awareness and real enjoyment of social existence, and as a totality of human manifestation of life. Thinking and being are thus certainly distinct, but at the same time, they are in unity with each other. On the other hand, death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the particular individual and to contradict their unity. But the particular individual is only a particular species being, and as such, mortal. Just as private property is only the perceptible expression of the fact that man becomes objective for himself, and at the same time becomes to himself a strange and inhuman object, just as it expresses the fact that the manifestation of his life is the alienation of his life, that his realization is his loss of reality, is an alien reality. So the positive transcendence of private property, i.e., the perceptible appropriation for and by man of the human essence and of human life, of objective man, of human achievements, should not be conceived merely of the sense of immediate, one-sided enjoyment, merely in the sense of possessing, of having. This is, how fetishism operates, right? Man appropriates his comprehensive essence in a comprehensive manner. That is to say, as a whole man, even of his human relations to the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, observing, experiencing, wanting, acting, loving. In short, all the organs of his individual being, like those organs which are directly social in their form, are in their objective orientation, or in their orientation to the object. That is, the appropriation of the object, the appropriation of human reality. Their orientation to the object is the manifestation of the human reality. For this reason, it is just as highly varied as the determinations of human essence and activities. It is human activity and human suffering. For suffering, humanly considers a kind of self-enjoyment of man. There's a lot of philosophical stuff going on here. Private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, or when it is directly possessed, eaten, drunk, worn, inhabited. In short, when it is used by us. Although private property itself, again, conceives all these direct realizations of possession only as means of life, and the life which they serve as means is the life of private property, that is, labor and conversion into capital. In the place of all physical and mental senses has therefore come the sheer estrangement of all these senses, the sense of having. So he's making this distinction, a distinction about possession. The human being had to be reduced to this absolute poverty in order that he might yield his inner wealth to the outer world on the category of having. See Hess in the philosophy of the deed. The abolition, the Aufhebung of the abolition of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities. But it is this emancipation precisely because these senses and attributes have become subjectively and objectively human. The eye has become a human eye, just as its object has become a social human object, an object made by man for man. You can see where you can extrapolate to the gaze. The senses have therefore become directly, in their practice, theoreticians. They relate themselves to the thing for the sake of the thing. But the thing itself is an objective human relation to itself and to man. In practice, I can relate myself to a thing humanly only if the thing relates itself humanly to the human being, and vice versa. Need or enjoyment have consequently lost its egotistical nature, and nature has lost its mere utility by use becoming human use. See, there's a redefinition of what counts as pragmatism built into this. In the same way, the senses and enjoyment of other men have become my own appropriation. Besides these direct organs, therefore, social organs develop in the form of society. Thus, for instance, activity in direct association with others has become an organ for expressing my own life and a mode of appropriating human life. March Madness. It is obvious that the human eye enjoys things in a way different from the crude, non-human eye. The human ear different from the crude ear, etc. We've seen that man does not lose himself in his object only when the object becomes for him a human object or objective man. This is possible only when the object becomes for him a social object. He himself, for himself, a social being, just as society becomes a being for him in this object. Now, on the one hand, therefore, it is only when the objective world becomes everywhere for man and society, the world of man's essential powers, that is human reality, and for that reason, the reality of his own essential powers, that all objects become for him the objectification of himself, become objects which confirm and realize his individuality, become his objects. That is, man himself becomes the object. The manner in which they become his depends on the nature of the objects and on the nature of the essential power corresponding to it. For it's precisely the determinate nature of this relationship which shapes the particular real mode of affirmation. To the eye, an object comes to be other than it is to the ear, and the object of the eye is another object than the object of the ear. The specific character of each essential power is precisely its specific essence, and therefore also the specific mode of its objectification, of its objectively actual living being. Thus, man is affirmed in the objective world not only in the act of thinking, but with all his senses. On the other hand, let us look at this in its subjective aspect as opposed to its objective aspect. Just as only music awakens in man the sense of music, and just as the most beautiful music has no sense for the unmusical ear, is no object for it, because my object can only be the confirmation of one of my essential powers, it can therefore only exist for me insofar as my essential power exists for itself as a subjective capacity. Because the meaning of an object for me only goes so far as my sense goes. That is, has only a meaning for a sense corresponding to that object. For this reason, the senses of the social man differ from those of the non-social man. Only through the objectively unfolded richness of man's essential being is the richness of subjective human sensibility, a musical ear, an eye for beauty of form, in short, senses capable of human gratification, senses affirming themselves as essential powers of man, either cultivated, i.e., culture, or brought into being. For not only the five senses, but also the so-called mental senses, the practical senses, that is, will, love, etc., in a word, human sense, the human nature of the senses comes to be by virtue of its object, by virtue of humanized nature. The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. The sense, caught up in crude practical need, has only a restricted sense. For the starving man, it is not the human form of food that exists, but only its abstract existence as food. It could just as well be there in its crudest form, and it would be impossible to say wherein this feeding activity differs from that of animals. The care-burdened, poverty-stricken man has no sense for the finest play. The dealer in minerals sees only the commercial value, but not the beauty and the specific character of the mineral. He has no mineralogical sense. Thus, the objectification of the human essence, both in its theoretical and practical aspects, is required to make man's sense human, as well as to create the human sense corresponding to the entire wealth of human and natural substance. Just as through the movement of private property, of its wealth as well as its poverty, of its material and spiritual wealth and poverty, the budding society finds at hand all the material for this development, so established society produces man in this entire richness of his being, produces the rich man profoundly endowed with all the senses as its enduring reality. Now, we see how subjectivity and objectivity, spirituality and materiality, activity and suffering lose their antithetical character, and thus their existence as such antitheses only within the framework of society. That is, we see how the resolution of the theoretical antitheses is only possible in a practical way by virtue of the practical energy of man to achieve synthesis, of course. Their resolution is therefore by no means merely a problem of understanding, but a real problem of life, which philosophy could not solve precisely because it conceived the problem as merely a theoretical one. We see how the history of industry and the established objective existence of industry are the open book of man's essential powers, the perceptibly existing human psychology. Hitherto, this was not conceived in its connection with man's essential being, but only in an external relation of utility, because, moving into the realm of estrangement, people could only think of man's general mode of being, religion or history in its abstract general characters, politics, art, literature, etc., as the reality of man's essential powers and man's species activity. Now, we have before us the objectified essential powers of man in the form of sensuous, alien, useful objects, in the form of estrangement displayed in ordinary material industry, which can be conceived either as a part of that general movement, or that movement can be conceived as a particular part of industry, since all human activity hitherto has been labor, that is, industry, activity estranged from itself. A psychology for which this book, the part of history existing in the most perceptible and accessible form, remains a closed book, cannot become a genuine, comprehensive, and real science. What indeed are we to think of a science which airily abstracts from this large part of human labor and which fails to feel its own incompleteness? While such a wealth of human endeavor unfolded before it means nothing more to it than perhaps what can be expressed in one word: need, vulgar need. The natural sciences have developed an enormous activity and have accumulated an ever-growing mass of material. Philosophy, however, has remained just as alien to them as they remain to philosophy. Their momentary unity was only a chimerical illusion. The will was there, but the power was lacking. Historiography itself pays regard to natural science only occasionally as a factor of enlightenment, utility, and of some special great discoveries. But natural science has invaded and transformed human life all the more practically through the medium of industry and has prepared human emancipation, although its immediate effect had to be the furthering of the dehumanization of man. Industry is the actual historical relationship of nature and therefore of natural science to man. Therefore, if industry is conceived as the exoteric revelation of man's essential powers, we also gain an understanding of the human essence of nature, or the natural essences of man. In consequence, natural science will lose its abstractly material, or rather its idealistic tendency, and will become the basis of human science, as it's already become, albeit in an estranged form, the basis of actual human life. And to assume one basis for life and a different basis for science is, of course, as a matter, a lie. The nature which develops in human history, the genesis of human society, is man's real nature. Hence, nature as it develops through industry, even though in an estranged form, is true anthropological nature. Sense perception, see Feuerbach, must be the basis for all science. Only when it proceeds from sense perception in the twofold form of sensuous consciousness and sensuous need is it true science. All history is the history of preparing and developing man to become the object of sensuous consciousness and turning the requirements of man as man into his needs. History itself is a real part of natural history, of nature developing into man. Natural science will in time incorporate into itself the science of man, just as the science of man will incorporate into itself natural science. There will be one science, right? So you see the germ of the ecological consciousness there, right? The metabolic stuff. Man is the immediate object of natural science. For immediate sensuous nature for man is immediately human sensuousness. The expressions are identical. presented immediately in the form of the other man sensuously present for him. Indeed, his own sense perception first exists as human sensuousness for himself through the other man. But nature is the immediate object of the science of man. The first object of man, is nature, sensuousness. And the particular human sensuous essential powers can only find their self-understanding in the science of the natural world in general, just as they can find their objective realization only in natural objects. The element of thought itself, the element of thought's living expression, that is language, is of a sensuous nature. The social reality of nature and human natural science, or the natural science of man, are identical terms. So here we see the first framing of language as a form of cultural production. It will be seen how in place of the wealth and poverty of political economy come the rich human being and the rich human need. The rich human being is simultaneously the human being in need of a totality of human manifestations of life, the man in whom his own realization exists as an inner necessity, as need. Not only wealth, but likewise the poverty of man under the assumption of socialism receives in equal measure a human and therefore social significance. Poverty is the passive bond which causes the human being to experience the need of the greatest wealth, the other human being. The dominion of the objective being in me, the sensuous outburst of my life activity, is passion, which thus becomes here the activity of my being. A being only considers himself independent when he stands on his own feet, and he only stands on his own feet when he owes his existence to himself. A man who lives by the grace of another regards himself as a dependent being. Now, but I live completely by the grace of another if I owe him not only the maintenance of my life, but if he has, moreover, created my life, if he is the source of my life. When it is not of my own creation, my life has necessarily a source of this kind outside of it. The creation is therefore an idea very difficult to dislodge from popular consciousness. The fact that nature and man exist on their own account is incomprehensible to it because it contradicts everything tangible in practical life. The creation of the earth has received a mighty blow from geognosy, i.e. from the science which presents the formation of the earth, the development of the earth as a process, as a self-generation. Generatio equivoca is the only practical refutation of the theory of creation. Now, it's certainly easy to say that the single individual, what Aristotle has already said, you've been begotten by your father and your mother, therefore in you, the mating of two human beings, a species act of human beings, has produced the human being. You see, therefore, that even physically, man owes his existence to man. Therefore, you must not only keep sight of the one aspect, that is, the infinite progression which leads you further to inquire who begot my father, who is his grandfather, etc. You must also hold on to the circular movement, sensuously perceptible in that progress by which man repeats himself in procreation, man thus always remaining the subject. You will reply, however, I grant you the circular movement. Now grant me the progress which drives me ever further until I ask who begot the first man and nature as a whole. I can only answer you, your question is itself a product of abstraction. Ask yourself how you arrived at that question. Ask yourself whether your question is not posed from a standpoint to which I cannot reply, because it is wrongly put. Ask yourself whether that progress as such exists for a reasonable mind. When you ask yourself about the creation of nature and man, you are abstracting, and in so doing, from man and nature. You postulate them as non-existent, and yet you want me to prove them to you as existing. Now I say to you, give up your abstraction, and you will also give up your question. Or if you want to hold on to your abstraction, then be consistent. And if you think of man and nature as non-existent, then think of yourself as non-existent, for you too are surely nature and man. Don't think, don't ask me, for as soon as you think and ask, your abstraction from the existence of nature and man has no meaning? Or are you such an egoist that you conceive everything as nothing and yet want yourself to exist? You can reply, I do not want to postulate the nothingness of nature, etc. I ask you about its genesis, just as I ask the anatomist about the formation of bones, etc. But since for the socialist man, the entire so-called history of the world is nothing but the creation of man through human labor, nothing but the emergence of nature for man, so he has the visible, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself, of his genesis. Since the real existence of man and nature has become evident in practice through sense experience, because man has thus become evident for man as the being of nature, and nature for man as the being of man, the question about about an alien being, about a being above nature and man, a question which implies the admission of the unreality of nature and of man, has become impossible in practice. Atheism, as the denial of this unreality, has no longer any meaning, for atheism is a negation of God and postulates the existence of man through this negation. But socialism, as socialism no longer stands in any need of such mediation, it proceeds from the theoretically and practically sensuous consciousness of man and of nature as the essence. Socialism is man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the abolition of religion, just as real life is man's positive reality, no longer mediated through the abolition of private property through communism. Communism is the position as the negation of the negation and is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and rehabilitation. Communism is the necessary form and the dynamic principle of the immediate future, but communism as such is not the goal of human development, the form of human society. So, anyway, um, you know, luxury communism ahead, right? The point being is that early Marx is asking interesting existential and phenomenal questions, suggesting that one of the real problems is, of course, rooted in the problem of property, of the difference between possession and just existence itself. And there's some interesting questions there. And of course, the property question is easily resolved. Well, easily resolved theoretically. And reality is always, all these other psychic problems. So the Code of Capital, how the law creates wealth and inequity. The Code of Capital is a book by Katerina Pistor. It's written from the point of view of a lawyer, but as I've said, with in terms of Marxism and law, it is a question of is it how private is the property? What counts as the private? What counts as the social? And by contrast, and under communism, or at least if you take the kind of Soviet model of it, it is it has more absolute elements to it, and it recognizes that there is no property, or it is state, everything is state property because you're part of the state, and people are part of the state. It is that absolute form of democratic socialism, as they say. Problematic for all the usual historical reasons, but the point is wealth and inequality are, as I think you can see in the above, early Marx is important for him for one to consider about what counts as wealth creation, that it inevitably is collective if you do it in the world. And so, it's, it may make insecure people, freak out, because, people are always trying to steal your shit. But, that one needs to get a better sense of it. And in fact, that's where it becomes a different sense of coming to grips with one's consciousness in that sense. So there's a kind of psychologism, as it were, underlying the early Marx, the humanist Marx, and you can see that he's aware of that, and one of the reasons why people pursued the lesser known texts of Marx or the early Marx, et cetera, is to sort of grab hold of the fact that Marx worried about all of these things. It's just that simply, we wound up with a critique of political economy and capital, but he wasn't just simply talking about economic matters. He was stating a much more integrated sort of sense of the world. So, law shapes the distribution of wealth. Capital is the defining feature of modern economies, yet most people have no idea where it actually comes from. What is it exactly that transforms mere wealth into an asset that automatically creates more wealth? The Code of Capital explains how capital is created behind closed doors in the offices of private attorneys, and why this little known fact is one of the biggest reasons for the widening wealth gap between the holders of capital and everybody else. You could also say, if you wanted to extrapolate, Trump's attack on private law firms is part of that, making it's not simply revenge. It is about making private law more compliant to his particular kinds of demands, which is, of course, about wealth creation for himself and perhaps other people, although he doesn't give a shit about other people. In this revealing book, Pistor argues that the law selectively codes certain assets, endowing them with the capacity to protect and produce private wealth. That's the whole big point of, her discussion of international law. With the right legal coding, any object, claim, or idea can be turned into capital. Now, you see, this is where it takes on that problematic element of what counts as property. And this is where, as I've mentioned before, in what I yammered about today, is what counts as juridical, right? It's actually a return to the church in that sense. With the right legal coding, any object, claim, or idea can be turned into capital, and lawyers are the keepers of the code. And different legal systems and legal devices for clients and, whatever, coding stocks, bonds, ideas, and even expectations, assets that only exist in law. Now, the point is, of course, debt, complex financial products, and other assets are coded to give financial advantage to their holders. And, that's half the battle, and it's the reason to keep lawyers around. This provocative book paints a troubling portrait of the pervasive global nature of the code, the people who shape it, and the governments that enforce it. So that's all, that's the current political climate, etc. And other matters, coercion, whatever, corporations, etc. So there's that. I see by the clock on the wall, I think, that I have achieved or not achieved the end of my little yammering here. So I will see what. Christopher Caldwell. Yes, indeed. Another sad example of, international brigades and the Spanish Civil War. Let's see. Utopian's building. Yes, perhaps. All righty. Those are the comments. Thank you very much. Let me, because we're approaching the usual end point, let me stop share and cut off the